that is what we need to be focused on.
Thank you. Order. I referred earlier to events in the chamber yesterday. What I'm about to say, I say as much for the benefit of people observing our proceedings as for members of the House. I think it is extremely important that our proceedings are accessible to the people who are interested in them. In light of the appalling atmosphere in the chamber yesterday and the toxicity which it can spawn or exacerbate in the country at large, I have granted an urgent question to the honourable member for Birmingham Yardley, which treats of this matter. In my book, it is manifestly urgent. Urgent question, Jess Phillips.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I had wanted to ask the Prime Minister, but I shall ask the Minister if he could ask the Prime Minister to reflect on his language and his role as Prime Minister to create a safe environment both in our country and in our country's Parliament.
Thank you. Minister Kevin Foster.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. British democracy has always been robust and vibrant. Healthy, respectful debate is vital to our democracy. Freedom of speech is a fundamental British liberty, but it is not an excuse to threaten or abuse anyone whose views you do not agree with. That liberty is compromised when a culture of intimidation forces people out of public life or discourages citizens from engaging in the political process. Let me make clear and say with no equivocation, such behaviour is wrong, unacceptable and must be addressed. The government recognises this is an ongoing challenge. It doesn't stop after each election. It is important we tackle this issue and ensure everyone, no matter their background, can participate in our democracy free from hatred and intimidation. That is why we are taking action to confront it. The government is committed to legislate for a new electoral offence on intimidation of candidates and campaigners in the run-up to an election. We have already made secondary legislation that removes the requirement for candidates standing at local and mayoral elections to have their home addresses published on the ballot paper, and will do the same for the Greater London Assembly elections. Members across this House have faced threats of violence, attacks on their constituency offices and staff, and abuse aimed at family members. This is abhorrent. I know honourable and right honourable members from across the House raised this concern yesterday. We want to ensure people from across this political spectrum can stand for office free from the fear of intimidation and abuse. We want to tackle this extremely serious issue and protect voters. The security arrangements for members of Parliament have been kept under constant review by the Palace of Westminster authorities and the Metropolitan Police's Parliamentary Liaison and Investigation Team. Local forces engage with their MPs and other political figures to meet their security needs. Each force has a single point of contact in place who has contact with the plate through regular updates and meetings as required. The Government are also considering what further steps are necessary to ensure the safety of parliamentarians and their staff. Crucially, this applies not only to the vicinities of Parliament, but also in constituencies and online. Thus, we are working with social media companies to address threats online and abuse of MPs, candidates and others in public life to create a safe environment for debate.
Thank you. Jess Phillips.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I did ask a question, and that was if the Prime Minister would reflect, or he would be asked to reflect. I'm just going to start by saying that I am not, and nobody in here is a traitor. They're not ignoring their constituents. They are all in good faith. I was raised thinking that we were the goodies and that over there were the baddies, and what I found when I got here was that everybody pretty much, just in a different way, wants to get to the same conclusion. And I will wager that, more so than the Prime Minister, I spend time in my constituency office loving and laughing with my constituents, no matter what they voted. I don't just want to probe into the idea that we all get abuse, and no doubt we're going to hear a lot of that today, because we all get abuse, and I've had a death threat this week that literally quoted the Prime Minister and used the Prime Minister's name and words in a death threat that was delivered to my staff. so we know that it gets out. What I want to look at today, and what I want answers to today, is when there is a clear strategy to divide. The use of language yesterday and over the past few weeks, such as the surrender bill, such as invoking the war, such as talking about betrayal and treachery, it has clearly been tested and workshopped and worked up, and it is entirely designed to inflame hatred and division. I get it. It works. It is working. I mean, we're all ambitious. I'm not going to pretend that I'm not ambitious, but I also have a soul. It is not sincere. It is totally planned. It is completely and utterly a part of a strategy designed by somebody to harm and cause hatred in our country. When I hear of my friend's murder and the way that it has made me and my colleagues feel, and feel scared, described as humbug, I actually don't feel anger towards the Prime Minister. I feel pity for those of you who still have to toe his line. You, the people opposite me, know how appalling it was to describe the murder of my friend as mere humbug. Can I ask everybody to act with calm and dignity in this moment? I want to ask the Prime Minister to apologise and to tell him that the bravest, strongest thing to say is sorry. It will make him look good. It will not upset the people who want Brexit in this country if he acts for once like a statesman. Calling me names, putting words in my mouth and in the mouth of my dead friend makes me cross and angry. It makes me scared even. But I will not react. The Prime Minister wants me to react so that I join in the chaos that keeps this hatred and fear on our streets. I simply ask the Minister today to request to the Prime Minister, who's notable by his bravery today, I ask him to ask the Prime Minister to meet with me in private with his advisers and some of my colleagues and my friends from Joe's family so that we can explain our grief and try to make him understand why it is so abhorrent that he has chosen a strategy to divide rather than to lead.
Minister Foster.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I will show a calm and dignity in my responses today as well. I would be very clear that the government is looking at how we create a safe environment, and not just in terms of for members of Parliament, but for journalists and for the others in public life who can face abuse merely for wanting to be involved in what they do, and of course members of the judiciary. I'm always clear no one is a traitor for saying what they believe or for arguing a different political point. That is part of public debate. The last actual traitor was in 1946, someone who tried to support those looking to overturn this democracy via violent means. But I think it is right to say that the government is moving to take action. We have the online harms white paper, working with colleagues in the Department for Culture, Media and Sport to tackle some of the corrosive nature of the debate online. We see some of the work being done across government to try and tackle where things are being done and to make sure people do feel safe to express their views, and being very clear that the law applies as much online as it does in the physical world. And I think we can all look at what may have been said over years, and I'm sure the honourable member will look at anything she said over the years about particular political figures as well. But it is about how we don't get into a game of whataboutery, but it's how we focus on what we can do to protect. And also heard the comments you made this morning, Mr. Speaker, about some of the suggestions, and I'm sure you, like me, will be interested to hear some of the thoughts that come out about that idea that has been floated with you. And of course, as the Minister whose responsibility it is for our Defending Democracy programme, I'll be only too happy to meet with the Honourable Member to discuss in a different format to where it comes, and ultimately to see where we can go with the process to help. And as I say, we've already committed to legislate around intimidation at election time, one of the things that many picked up last time round following the election, and see this as an ongoing debate. Plus, even actually yesterday, if this House hadn't been meeting, I was due to be having a meeting with the police to discuss what we could do to ensure all candidates received support in any future general election, as it's not just about when people are members of this place that they would face intimidation and abuse. I would say, Mr. Speaker, the government is taking a range of actions, and ultimately it is for everyone to think about what they say and also how they've contributed. And certainly today, what they'll get from the government is a calm dignity in response and making clear what we are doing to tackle this issue and create a safe environment for all, not for debate, not just members of Parliament.
Maria Miller.
When it comes to creating a safe environment in this place, we have a very clear code of conduct, which is enforced, Mr. Speaker, by you in this chamber. Yesterday, you were rightly, I think, rigorous with the Prime Minister, as ever, in the enforcement of his behaviour in accordance with that code. Now, I have the very greatest respect for my honourable friend, the member for Birmingham Yardley. We serve on the Select Committee together, and I know how passionately she feels on many issues. But I'm afraid it was yesterday she was the person I could hear screaming the loudest from her bench. So noticeable was it that she was actually having a conversation with one of the whips that was standing by the side of your chair, Mr. Speaker. It was that which created a significant impression to people watching this debate of the hostility that the media reported. Mr. Speaker, isn't one of the issues here the equal implementation of the Code of Conduct so that all members of this House feel as affected by the Code and its requirement for all of us to treat each of us with respect, regardless of party?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Right Honourable Member makes a valid point that it's for all of us to look at how we contribute to respectful debate in this chamber. Of course, in terms of what happens in this chamber, it will be yourself, Mr. Speaker, and your deputies that will ensure that members stick to the codes and practices of conduct, and of course you have taken action when you believe that that is not occurring. But ultimately it is about, certainly for the government, not just about this place, but about the whole of democratic debate, because there are people who will be thinking of doing their democratic duties, they see it, in standing for this place, giving their fellow citizens a chance to vote for a particular set of policies, who will want to know that in doing so they'll have their arguments put to the test, they'll have their thoughts put to the test, their proposals put to the test. Well, they'll not be put to the test, it's just how thick a skin they've got.
He's absolutely right, what the Minister has said. That code of conduct has to be enforced and indeed, so far as the Chamber is concerned, adjudicated by the Chair. The record is clear, the evidence is there for all to see. People can observe week after week after week after week that there can be abuses on both sides, for example during Prime Minister's questions, and every time, without fail, the Chair intervenes to seek to restore order. It has been the case, it is the case, it will always be the case. It isn't a matter of party politics, it is a matter of procedural propriety, and that's the way it has to continue to be. Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I start by congratulating my friend, the member for Birmingham Yardley, for securing this question. It's extremely disappointing that the Prime Minister has not respected this House by attending here today. The Prime Minister's language and demeanour yesterday was frankly nothing short of disgraceful. 3 years ago, our colleague, our member, Joe Cox, was murdered by a far-right activist shouting, "Britain first, this is for Britain." The language that politicians use matters and have real consequences. To dismiss concerns from members about the death threats they receive and to dismiss concerns that the language used by the Prime Minister is being repeated in those death threats is reprehensible. To dismiss those concerns in an abusive way, as he did, is completely unacceptable. And I pay tribute to my honourable friends for Dewsbury and for Batley and Spen and other members, including the member for Broxtowe, for what they said yesterday. Today, I've written to all members of the Parliamentary Labour Party, expressing my solidarity to my friends and set out the conduct expected of all colleagues. No side of this House, as you've said, Mr. Speaker, has a monopoly of virtue. Inappropriate language has been used by all sides. But we all have a duty to keep our debates political and not to descend into personal abuse. I disagreed profoundly with the previous Prime Minister, but she did offer cross-party talks to try to find a compromise. She also set out her approach to this House, allowing for scrutiny and debate. I was also pleased to participate in a meeting with the former Prime Minister and other party leaders about conduct and abuse in the House and around the parliamentary estate. The current Prime Minister, unfortunately, has sought to entrench divisions, refused to set out any detail of the deal he is seeking, and continues to pledge that they will leave with no deal on the 31st of October, despite the fact that this House has voted against and legislated against an outcome. Not only should the Prime Minister comply with the law, he should come to this House and apologise for his conduct yesterday, which fell well below the standards expected by the people of this country of the way their elected representatives should behave, should speak and should treat each other.
Minister Foster.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I think it's clear that, having already outlined what the government is doing, but of course the Leader of the Opposition mentions the murder of Joe Cox, a dreadful crime committed by an extremist. And many of us who were in the House at that time remember exactly where we were when we heard the news of that appalling attack, in my case attending a constituency event, in the same way that many from a previous generation of politics remember where they were when they heard that our colleagues Anthony Berry or Robert Buckland or Airey Neave had been assassinated by those looking to bring terror to this country. So what I would say is that actually the biggest issue is that delay will just bring more division to this country. And in terms of having Bradford, I apologise, Robert Bradford. Thank you for correcting me, Mr. Speaker. In terms of looking to how we are tackling this as a government, we do need to bring a resolution to debates. And as the Leader of the Opposition will know, the government has been clear that we're prepared to take our arguments to the country on Tuesday, the 15th of October, and ask the electorate to pass a judgment. And that would have given a chance to not only resolve the division affecting this House, but also to give a way for the country to move forward. Because as you yourself have reflected, Mr. Speaker, the passions that this issue has inflamed will only carry on if there is not a resolution.
Anne Milton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I once again associate myself with the remarks that you made at the beginning of the proceedings today. I fear that the Minister is going to go to great lengths to take this argument to the wider issues of MP safety. But what this question is about is what happened here yesterday. It was completely unacceptable behaviour in every way. Whipping up a crowd, creating division is not helpful from whichever side it comes. If we cannot do this in this place, Mr. Speaker, maybe it is time to put aside our party parliamentary T-shirts, our Brexit Remain T-shirts, and put on a T-shirt that stands for parliamentary democracy, unity of purpose, consensus and agreement. Yesterday was unacceptable, and if we don't do something to change this, we are putting our parliamentary democracy at threat.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In terms of the question, it clearly relates to creating a safe environment both in the country and in Parliament. And certainly, as the Minister responsible, I don't want to see this about being a debate about MPs just being a case on our own. There are many who face abuse and intimidation for being part of this, from the judiciary to journalists and to those who will never be members of Parliament but who just want to take part in our democratic process. But as is touched on, we heard the comments you gave this morning, Mr. Speaker, about some of the thoughts and reflections on what may happen in this place, and ultimately it is for the House itself to decide how it wishes to regulate itself, how it wishes to behave, what changes it may have wished to make to its own standing orders, and of course we can rely on yourself, Mr. Speaker, and whoever's elected to replace you to lead the way in enforcing them.
Kirsty Blackman.
Mr. Speaker, as others have said, the scenes in the House of Commons last night were deeply disturbing. The Prime Minister's tone was appalling, his behaviour was appalling, and his language was appalling. We've got in number 10 a man who has built his career on making inflammatory remarks, stoking division and shouting down those who disagree with him. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister is not fit for office. His behaviour is an outrage, and his government is treating people disgracefully. People want leadership, Mr. Speaker, and they want accountability. What should have happened yesterday is that the Prime Minister should have come in front of this House and apologised for acting unlawfully. He should have held his hands up, agreed he'd acted wrongly, and pledged not to do it again. Instead, he chose to brazen it out, proving that he embodies the very worst of the wrongs in our society and totally ignoring the 7 principles of public life. Mr. Speaker, young people are watching our Parliament today. They're watching and learning that in order to get to the top, all you need to do is break the law and shout people down. The House of Commons and the Prime Minister should be setting a good example to all of those living across these aisles. The Prime Minister should be here today. The Prime Minister should pledge to stop using language that incites hatred or violence, whether that's against other MPs, citizens with different political beliefs, or migrants who've chosen to come and live and work in the UK. Will the Minister ask the Prime Minister to come before us and do that?
Hear, hear. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have to say, when we look at how we reflect on creating a safe environment for debate, I'm sure many colleagues will be reflecting on exactly how that was shown in the times online in the 2014 Scottish independence referendum. But I think what I would say is, hearing the comments that have just been made, if the Scottish National Party has no confidence in the Prime Minister, then there was a perfect opportunity offered yesterday for them to table a motion for debate to that effect today. There was also an opportunity for them to take their arguments to the country on Tuesday, the 15th of October. However, it's an invitation they declined.
The issue, that's a disgraceful thing to do. Sir Bernard Jenkin.
Speaker, there is already a danger in these exchanges of it turning into a holier-than-thou competition. And I think we should reflect on how much unhappiness and anxiety there is amongst members of the House, and that this is going to be expressed in various ways. And people are going to use robust and emotive language in order to express their views, and that is entirely understandable. May I just make one request, Mr. Speaker? That we no longer invoke the name of any person who has been a victim of attacks in order to try and make political points. Because, well, there we are. Because it is simply used as an opportunity to shame other members of this House. I don't personally think any of the exchanges and mentions of Joe Cox yesterday was particularly fair on her family.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it's always useful to benefit from the experience of the right honourable member in this House over many years. And he's right to say that we can have robust, we can have emotive debates. The issues settled in this Parliament are matters of great concern across the nation, and rightly people will get passionate about that. But in doing so, we should not do so with disrespect. And I know, of course, if that had happened, that would be dealt with.
Winson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I would just gently say to the honourable gentleman opposite that I don't think it is for any member of this House to determine whether another member can talk about their own grief and how they feel in a certain circumstance and whether that should somehow not be allowed. The language that leaders use matters because it sets the tone for public debate. And I'm sure I'm not alone in looking across the Atlantic at the rallies of crowds of people chanting "lock her up" about Hillary Clinton or "send her back" about Ilhan Omar. And by the way, it is no coincidence that it is women that are often the targets of this hate, and especially women of colour, and see worrying echoes in our own politics of that Trumpian approach. And so I ask the Minister whether he can give any assurance that there will be no deliberate campaign to use that kind of language to inflame. But I fear he cannot, because the repeated use of those inflammatory words by the Prime Minister yesterday was, it seemed, very obviously deliberate. And I would just end by saying, Mr. Speaker, that on Tuesday morning I spoke to a group of 400 young women. They asked me how I dealt with abuse and hate on social media as a woman in public life. They asked me whether they thought going into politics was something I would recommend. I want to be able to say to young women like that and to all young people that they should play their role in public life. And we need to be able to, those of us in this House, create the environment that enables those young people to come forward into our public life, and I fear that we are failing to do so.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think we all want to see an environment where everyone feels they can take part. That's why I've already outlined some what the government's looking to do around legislating, around intimidation, around election times. And she gives some examples of what we've seen over the Atlantic. I'm sure she'd join me, and whilst I never voted for him, seeing a group of people chanting "Tony Blair can F off and die" is something that we would all condemn. I see her indication of that as well. But what actually would inflame further debate is the idea that if we just have more delay and people feel that when they do vote and do have a say, they are then ignored. That is why we do need to bring the Brexit matter to a resolution, as the government is seeking to do.
Mr. Kenneth Clark.
I was only just beginning to stir, Mr. Speaker. You spotted me rather promptly. What concerns me about all this is whether there's any sense of a deliberate strategy in all this, and I'd like my honourable friend to reassure me. I assure him I have been a junior minister myself, so I do realise he's probably not consulted closely about strategy, but I'm not sure that many members of the Cabinet have much idea of what the strategy is at the moment. But can you allay two fears I have? It seems to me that, firstly, the Prime Minister is absolutely desperate to have an election before the 31st of October, so he can fight it before the chance there is of perhaps some untoward effects after that date. And I also fear that the strategy is to fight it on this People versus Parliament platform that Nigel Farage invented and which we're now being imitating. Can my honourable friend assure me that what happened yesterday was one of these occasions when people lost control of themselves and the House, not for the first time, erupted in disorder, and this isn't part of some grand discrediting of the usual political institutions in order to fight a populist and nationalist campaign.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, as a junior minister, it's always welcome to benefit from the advice of the Father of the House. What I would reassure him is that the strategy the government has is to do what the vast majority of the nation wants to see, which is to bring a resolution to Brexit and deliver the referendum result. And I noticed, even given his own views, the Father of the House has voted for deals and seeing that as compromising and moving forward. And where the government will look to fight a general election is a platform of resolving Brexit, no more delay, pointlessly, for bringing 20,000 extra police officers onto our street, increasing school funding and taking our economy forward. And I have to say our platform will be far stronger than one opposite.
Having called the Father of the House, I want now to call the Mother of the House, Harriet Harman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my honourable friend for bringing this urgent question, and to you for your comments last night and for your comments from the Chair this morning. I agree with the Father of the House in everything that he said, and I think that what happened last night was just an ugly spectacle of things getting even worse that have been happening for months and months. And we all know that honourable members on all sides of the House have felt inhibited in doing their work that they are elected to this place to do. It is important, it's essential, that everybody who's elected to this House is able to speak out without fear or favour to say what they believe in. And nobody in this House should do anything that stops any other member exercising that right. And whether it's threats to people who are Remainers, or whether it's people in balaclavas bursting into a university meeting which was being addressed by the Leader of the House, we cannot allow that in our democracy. Nor can we have a situation where members are fearful not only for themselves and their own safety, but their staff and also their families. Now, the government minister has mentioned a number of initiatives, and heaven knows we've had enough discussion and wringing our hands about these problems over the months in this chamber. We have had a number of initiatives, but there is a lack of coherence and focus for action. And that's why the Father of the House and myself have proposed that there should be a Speakers' Conference that brings together the police, the CPS, the House authorities, the parties, and looks at what can be done to ensure that we protect our democracy. And it also needs to look at our political culture. We know, for example, that we cannot call each other blackguard or gutter snipe or stool pigeon or various other things. We need to have rules of this House that are updated and protect us to enable us to do our business today.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I can reflect the productive conversation and meeting I had when the Mother of the House was present with the Women's Caucus, when again people should be able to speak out. I think the example given there of one female candidate being advised that the solution to the problem was to not be on campaign on social media was a completely unacceptable solution that had been advised by a local council, thinking that was the way, was that women couldn't engage in politics in the same way as men, which was a completely unacceptable suggestion. But I do think she refers to some of the rules of this House. Clearly, Mr. Speaker, that would be something that you may wish to reflect on, or whoever happens to be elected by this House to replace you may wish to work on, as well as some of the expressions used are ones that probably aren't in common parlance today and compared to other statements that are. But certainly for the government, our focus is that this isn't just about members of Parliament, this is about all who engage in public life, journalists who face abuse for what they say, and others who just want to discharge a public duty or to share their opinion in our democracy, and we need to make sure they are covered by any proposals as well.
Justine Greening.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think, like many people in this chamber, I was shocked by the unacceptable conduct I felt of the Prime Minister, and particularly his attitude, which, frankly, succeeded that of the attitude of the Attorney General earlier in the day to how this House works. And my concern, Mr. Speaker, is that these institutions, both the one that we had debated earlier, the Supreme Court and the judiciary, and of course Parliament, the place where laws are set in the first place, are absolutely crucial to the well-being of people in our country. And we all rely on them. And all of those who are part of these institutions are effectively custodians for protecting their well-being in the future. And what we are seeing right now in British politics is effectively a deliberate, in my view, race to the bottom of a form of gutter politics that I have to say, unfortunately, directly disadvantages those of us not willing to be part of that race. And I think the sooner that the leadership of the main political parties in this country rise to the challenge of showing the levels of integrity in their conduct and behaviour that the British people are entitled to expect, the better.
Yeah. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I always reflect well on the comments that are made by the Right Honourable Lady. I think what I would say is we are again, as a government, committed to ensuring that the public discourse, particularly online via the Online Harms White Paper, is not just about how we make sure that people are not breaching the law, how people can participate without fear of abuse, but also ensuring we can tackle some of the issues of disinformation, which can also have such a corrosive impact on our society. Ultimately, we do see that the social media giants have made some moves, but there is obviously a need to do even more.
Ed Miliband.
Mr. Speaker, all of us need to take care of our language, and none of us is without fault. But the Prime Minister of our country holds a special responsibility. And I say to members across this House, I spent 4.5 years opposite David Cameron. I never saw a performance like the performance we saw last night from this Prime Minister. He said this in answer to the Honourable Member for Hove. The best way, he said, to ensure that every parliamentarian is properly safe and to dial down the current anxiety in this country is to get Brexit done. Mr. Speaker, everyone in this House, I think, shares the frustration about the last 3.5 years. In fact, some of us didn't want the referendum to happen in the first place. But none of us can agree that the safety of members of this House should depend on the way they vote in this House. It is a disgrace that the Prime Minister said this yesterday. He should apologise, and the Minister should apologise on his behalf. Mr. Speaker, this and the language of surrender suggests we are at war either with Europe or with each other. Let me say, as someone who grew up with parents who were born in the shadow of war, we are not at war with Europe, and we are not at war with each other. Go down any street in this country, and there are people who voted Remain, and there are people who voted Leave. And there are people with different views about how Brexit should be resolved. The Prime Minister has a special responsibility. He is not exercising this responsibility. He is trying to divide an already divided country. Now, some people say this strategy will work. Mr. Speaker, I say this strategy will not work because the British people are better than this.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I must say it was interesting to hear the Right Honourable Member's brief mention of his parents. I remember the attacks he faced in terms of his own father and his reaction to them, which I thought took politics into a place when those attacks made was not appropriate. People should always judge members by who they are and what they say, not seek to attack their family. What I would say is that in terms of the strategy, I'm very clear when we liaise with the police and when we're talking with them about appropriate measures to be taken, that applies whatever opinion anyone takes within this House. And I suspect my discussions are more likely to focus on those who may strongly disagree with me, but have absolutely every right to put those arguments forward and to have measures in place to protect them, and not just from those things that cross the boundaries of the criminal law, but but also from incessant abuse online, particularly where ill-informed. But as we all know, we did give the British people we wanted to give as a government the British people an opportunity to express their views on Tuesday, the 15th of October 2019. Sadly, for the first time in history, a government that wanted an election to resolve a matter was blocked from doing so by the opposition.
Sir Desmond Swain.
There is a strategy. The Prime Minister is the last thing standing between ending the Brexit enterprise entirely. He can expect no quarter. Absolutely everything is going to be thrown at him, isn't it?
Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think it's safe to say, as you yourself, Mr. Speaker, reflected, that the Brexit process has caused passions and arguments and debate. But I think where the Prime Minister is very clear is that his view is the way to deal with this, and the government's view is to ensure that we deliver Brexit on the 31st of October 2019.
Stella Creasy.
Speaker, the challenge with what the Minister is saying is this isn't actually about Brexit, and nor, for many of us, is this about how do we make this stop. Because actually, if we want to do that, we need to understand where it starts and how the extremists on all sides of our political culture will trump proudly about how they might stand at Cable Street to defend people's rights, or will listen to Steve Bannon and disagree with him, but have absolutely no understanding or comprehension of how we get to that Cable Street, how we get to Steve Bannon in the first place. And the danger with the Prime Minister's conduct last night is it is feeding a culture and a language that normalises extremism, so that those of us who have had traitor shouted at us in the street, as well as online, because the online and the offline are no different, experience this as the heat of the kitchen rather than a language that does nobody any favours in our democracy. And I say to the Minister, the most important thing he can do now is go and listen to what we're missing, because this doesn't affect everyone equally. We're still going to have white men of a certain age with independent means in our politics. But it is the young people, it is the women, the people from minority communities who are already saying they're not going to take part in our politics, not because they've already experienced the rape threats and the death threats and the bomb threats and the intimidation, but because they see it. When the trolls are in Parliament, how do we stop feeding the trolls?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, as the member outlines, the importance that we get the message out there that action is being taken, not just online. As we said, the law applies online as it does offline, and that actually we say to people that they have a place here, that they can make a difference, and that their votes count. And ultimately, the longer indecision goes on one issue, Brexit, the more that there will be frustrations. But that doesn't justify people crossing the line of abuse, hatred and intimidation. And it needs to be clear that the same legal standard will apply whichever end of the extreme people are. Ultimately, some people are just two sides of the same coin of hate.
Colleagues, I'll take a few more, but what really is needed is a single-sentence question from each member. Caroline Noakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I fear I might be repetitive, because last night I asked the Prime Minister, my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, if it was not just about language, but also about tone. Now, I commend my honourable friend for his tone today, but how should he suggest I would respond to those in the beautiful marketplace of Romsey who 3 Saturdays ago told me I was a traitor who deserved to be shot, when the language of traitor is heard in this House?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, as I said earlier, there is no one in this House who is a traitor. There is no one in this House who should be threatened in that way, and that those who shouted that in the marketplace should realise that if they are making those sorts of nonsense and that sort of threats, that there is a criminal law they can be held accountable to.
Luciana Berger.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, our words carry consequences. They reverberate far and wide beyond these 4 walls. And the Prime Minister, who holds the highest office in our land, also bears the greatest responsibility for what he says and inspires. I don't believe the Minister can in one breath tell this House that he seeks to reduce online harm, while the Prime Minister booms out toxic, divisive soundbites, the clips of which are immediately posted and promoted on online hate-filled social media channels. We've seen the incidents of hate crime in our country increase. And as a member of this House who has seen no fewer than 6 people convicted of the harassment and the hate crimes directed at me, can I ask the Minister to take back to this Prime Minister that he has to urgently reconsider this deliberate strategy of sowing seeds of division in our country?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as the honourable member rightly points to, those who behave in certain ways will face the criminal justice system and conviction for their offences. But I would just gently reflect on the idea of a national party going round with bollocks to Brexit isn't necessarily going to help tone down the debate. And ultimately, for us all, there is, bringing a resolution to this issue is a key part of what this Parliament is meant to be here for. And if we cannot do it in this Parliament, then I'd look forward to having a mature, sensible and informed debate with the electorate that we should have been having on Tuesday, the 15th of October.
Sir Alan Duncan.
Speaker, if you were to reread your Samuel Pepys, you will find a line in the diaries of over 350 years ago which says that so low has this rump fallen in the eyes of the people that the lads in the street cry, "Kiss my Parliament." If we are to avoid that same reputation persisting today in our current politics, may I ask the Minister and all in this House to apply the same standards, Mr. Speaker, you are asking for today to our conduct of social media, and that it should include us, journalists and the wider public if we are not to see the continuing debasement of the body politic.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm not sure whether I'm going to be reducing the "to kiss my Parliament" adage again, but he's absolutely. Well, I suppose never kissed an MP. There's a new take on a famous T-shirt some people like to wear. But in terms of it, he's absolutely right to say that it's not just about MPs. It is about journalists, judges, anyone involved in public life. Some of the comments this morning we've seen directed at one journalist would hardly be seen to be as the top brow of political debate. But as I say, it is about the government's looking to create an environment that's safe for all to engage in, not just within this House, because ultimately it's that culture of debate outside this House that will reflect in the politics of Parliament that is elected to be in this House.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Down the years since I've been a member of this House, we have had memorable and important debates on highly contested issues. On Iraq, when I remember Robin Cook's speech, on 9/11, when I remember David Blunkett's speech, on the Great Crash, when I actually remember Gordon Brown's speech. When I come into the chamber today, and I think last night was the culmination of a trend, I feel I'm coming into a session of the Bullington Club. That's what it feels like in here. And that culture is set by the leadership. It is always set by the leadership. I think that the courageous thing that the Prime Minister could have done today was to come to this House and explain to us why he thinks that leadership is appropriate. In his absence, will the Minister tell us what are the practical steps that the Prime Minister will undertake to set a new culture of leadership which brings this House back to sensible debate on critical issues and makes us the important chamber we should be?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I do sometimes wonder and reflect, if we look at some of the great debates and issues of the past, how the political discourse may have been affected if things like Twitter, Facebook and social media had existed at that time, certainly going back to the 1975 referendum. But I think what I would say the Prime Minister, when the government will do, is we will continue the work we've already outlined to tackle intimidation, hatred and abuse, and also in terms of, for this Parliament, bringing back a deal to deliver the referendum and finally put the Brexit issue to bed. And I hope that's one we can look forward to wide cross-party support for.
Helen Grant.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In terms of creating more diversity in Parliament, does the Minister agree with me that this toxic, nasty, aggressive behaviour coming from all sides of the House, it just does, is something that's stopping many more women and some men from coming to this place, from feeling safe, from enjoying it, and believing Parliament is a place where they can achieve and progress and reach their full potential?
Hear, hear. Oh, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hear the honourable member's passion, and we do want to see more people coming in and feeling that they can stand, and not just as members of Parliament, but also in terms of their local council, to be an elected mayor, to be a police and crime commissioner, and not face some of the type of abuse that some sadly have faced over recent years. But ultimately also it's about people seeing Parliament as a place where things are decided, where things move on, not as a place that literally ends up going on a merry-go-round of delay, but not actually making a decision on behalf of the nation. Because that's ultimately why people stand, is to make that difference. And we want to see people from all backgrounds. I'm a comprehensive school kid, the son of a painter labourer. Not many of my type used to get into Parliament. I can now.
Well, Sheriff.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, I asked the Prime Minister to moderate his language, and I desperately wanted to remind him that words have consequences. And I accept that it's necessary for all of us in this place to reflect on our language and our behaviour. After all, I do accept that I have been known to have the odd heckle in here. And I'm grateful this morning for the solidarity from my fellow MPs, including many on the government benches. But last night, I was literally horrified to see a tweet from the member for Middlesbrough South and East Cleveland. And I have informed his office, Mr. Speaker, that I would be raising this issue this morning. I will not refer to him as honourable. He sent a tweet last night appearing to mock me, referring to the Labour Party as toxic, which sadly brought more abuse. The Minister this afternoon said his government wants to stamp out abuse, but how can we believe him when the Prime Minister refers to genuine concerns from female MPs as humbug? And the Prime Minister's official spokesperson this morning has confirmed that the Prime Minister has no regrets about the language that he used. So, will the Minister confirm to me that the tweet from the member for Middlesbrough and East Cleveland reflects that of the government? And will he also take the opportunity, further to the comments from the Prime Minister's official spokesperson, to say that he stands by the Prime Minister's comment that threats to female MPs, death threats and daily abuse is humbug?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Having had the odd heckle of my own speeches from the honourable member, I always recognise the spirit in which they are done, of passionate competition rather than and disagreement rather than necessary disrespect of the remarks I make. I think what I would say is the government is looking at the Defend Democracy programme, is taking action around online harms, and is looking to tackle the social media giants about this issue. And ultimately, I think where I would say, as the Minister who's got responsibility for this policy area, is that actually it's about looking at what the government will bring forward. I hope we'll certainly have her support in doing so when we do bring legislation forward around intimidation before an election, and that's ultimately where the test of this will be, is in what difference we can all make in terms of legislation and in tackling those who feel an impunity to abuse people online in a way they would never do on the street.
Vicky Ford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a sad fact that a study of parliaments across Europe showed that more than 4 out of 10 women MPs have received threats of death, rape or beating. The language that we use does matter, and the language yesterday, actually from all sides of the House, was unacceptable. We need to dial it down. I would also like to remind people, unfortunately, that the protest on the night when we last met also unleashed a huge amount of hatred towards people who had voted leave. And colleagues who had voted leave on this House have literally had to pull nails and screws out of their car tyres last week because of the threats and the language used against them. And the Liberal Democrats, sadly, are not innocent here either. 4 actions I'd like to see. 4? First of all, Mr. Speaker.
One sentence.
Mr. Speaker, please can you continue to make sure you are fair and balanced, because sometimes it doesn't feel like this. Secondly, please can all members of this House, including our front bench, dial down the language. Thirdly, please can we all work together to heal the divisions in our country, and that means respecting democracy. And fourthly, because it matters, please can we bring the domestic abuse bill back to this House?
I would just very gently say to the House, as experienced members know, there was a time when statements didn't run very long. Not many members got called. That's changed, and over the last decade, I call almost everybody most of the time. The idea that if you don't call everyone every time that they want to speak, that is somehow unfair, is so manifestly absurd that I think most of the House would recognise it as such. I do what I can to stand up for the rights of this House and honourable and right honourable members on both sides of it. I've done it for a decade. I'm doing it now. I'll go on doing it. I'm standing up for the important principle of the decency of our democracy, and I would have thought that's pretty fair. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In terms of the issues the honourable member refers to, and I'll certainly compliment the work she does as the chair of the Women in Parliament group to make sure that women can, inside and outside of Parliament, have their views heard. And yes, it is about having a calm and dignified debate, to take challenge in the way it is meant, and to respond to it in a dignified way. And certainly the government is looking to work together to heal the divisions by bringing an end to the Brexit process, by delivering the result of the referendum. The longer the delay goes on and indecision, the more, sadly, this argument continues.
Dr. Rosanna Allen-Khan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was elected to this place on the day that Joe Cox was taken from us. A week later was the EU referendum. I have only ever known a politics of division in this place. It is beyond embarrassing that the Prime Minister has sent a junior minister with a folder full of rebuttals today, making every excuse in the book. So I ask this to the Minister. What does it say in your little folder about the Prime Minister acknowledging that unless he dials down the tone, unless he watches his language and adopts the position of statesperson, that the wounds that divide this country will turn into scars, permanent scars?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What I'd say to the honourable member is that she made the point herself, that it's been over 3 years in which this Parliament's been absolutely focused on rows and debates around Brexit. Hundreds of hours spent on it, unable to move on to the agenda that many people wish to see us discussing. And the best way to bring that to an end, to move on, is to support the Prime Minister in getting a deal to finally bring an end to this debate. And that's where I hope we'll have her support when he brings a deal back.
Mr. David Gork.
At best, the Prime Minister's answers to some of the questions last night were deeply insensitive. But the concern that many of us have is that there is a deliberate strategy of division and confrontation. Can the Minister reassure me that the Conservative Party and the Government is not going to pursue a strategy of division, of confrontation, and of the undermining of the institutions that protect the peace and stability of our citizens?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What I can reassure my right honourable friend is that the Conservative Party, in going into a general election, will go forward with a manifesto that seeks to serve the country and unite the country. But a key part of doing that is bringing a resolution to the Brexit process. I know he's supported a deal, and I hope when the Prime Minister brings back a deal, we can look forward to his support again.
We have another statement to follow in a moment from the Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. There is a motion to be voted upon, there is a further debate, and so we must proceed. I regret that because I like to hear everybody. There is a moment of interruption today in a way that there wasn't yesterday. We could extend yesterday, we can't today, and I have to take account of that. So, unless there is a point of order appertaining to this particular exchange, we... Very well. Point of order, David T.C. Davis.
Mr. Speaker, could you confirm that it would be unacceptable, under any circumstances, for a senior member of this House to say of a female MP, we should lynch the bastard?
Yes, is the answer to that. That would be totally unacceptable. I'm not aware of the particular circumstance to which the honourable gentleman is referring, but I can confirm that that is totally unacceptable. And no, I'm not going to take a whole series of points of order. Sorry, no, I'm not. I'm now going to proceed with the statement from the Secretary of State. Order, I don't require assistance from the honourable gentleman. We come now to the statement by the Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. Secretary